If you haven't seen Kakegurui yet, and you're into anime, manga, and other series with high stakes gambling or intense psychological situations, I recommend that you check it out yourself. This video will contain spoilers, as I plan to rank every game featured in the first two seasons of Kakegurui, and I'm not going to waste any time on a long introduction. Let's start with the lowest rated games in the series. Of course, everything here is my opinion, so feel free to disagree or agree in the comments below. Number 14, The Idol Games vs Yumemite in episodes 8 and 9 of season 1. It's not even really a game, it's just a singing competition, an excuse to put on idol outfits and add insert songs to the anime. At the very least, at the very end of this arc, which goes on for way too long by the way, they have a very short competition, but it's just to pick a random audience member and try to guess their birthday. Overall, Yumemite is my least favorite character in the series. She always takes away from the things that I enjoy about Kakegurui, and for whatever reason her arcs always go on for so much longer than they need to. You really didn't need to spend 2 episodes building up to a 30-second long game when it was essentially on the same level as guess what number I'm thinking about in my head right now. The only good thing about this arc is that it leads directly into the Manyuuda game from season 1, but I actually think if you completely cut Yumemite from the plot, you could have almost the exact same story. And unsurprisingly, number 13 are more idol games, this time versus Sumika, but still with Yumemite. It's in episodes 5 and 6 of season 2. This material was barely a step above the idol games from season 1. At least in this instance, they did have a few things that somewhat resembled actual games. The competition was focused on things like acting, not just singing and dancing, so there was a little bit of bluffing, a little bit of mental strategy at work here. Sometimes when I'm watching anime, I like to go and read comments on various threads and see what other people are saying, just because, well, I find it really interesting. I like to read impressions and reactions from other people. This episode was kind of controversial. It was like a 50-50 split on whether people loved it or hated it. For me, I'm definitely on the negative side. It was just another excuse to have more singing and dancing and insert songs. What's funny is that I actually like all of those things. I love music, I love dancing. I like when characters in the show sing their own songs too, especially if they use the real voice actors instead of like other professional singers, but not here. It didn't work for me. It's too out of place in this series, and again, they spent way too long on it. The game itself wasn't interesting, and the mechanics wouldn't make a lot of sense as a real game that people would ever play. They take turns placing down cards, but they're allowed to lie about the value, and then at some point they have to end the game and see if the total has gone bust or not. The issue is that even if you could guess when someone was lying, like if I knew for sure that you were lying, there are 9 different possible outcomes that you could be lying about. As the most basic example, I would just say 10 every single time I laid down a card, and then the other person would have no idea what the actual total value was. It could be anything from 1 to 10 every single turn. There's too much variance here. But actually this logic applies no matter which card I draw or which number I say. So the game is truly impossible to make any sense out of. The game really only served as an excuse to put Yumemite's bluffing skills on display for the last 3 minutes of a 2-episode long arc, so it was more material similar to my least favorite season 1 games, and again, they dedicated way too much time to this. If the Yumemite arcs had been like 1 episode each, they might have been a little bit more tolerable, but I'll leave it at that. Number 12, the tarot card game versus Kirari. Apparently this one is a filler. I like the part where Ryota decided to risk everything, and it was clear that Yumeko was impressed by it too. It was a good character moment for him, but ultimately this wasn't much of a game. It was just them pointlessly gambling everything on a really random wager. So the way this game works is they lay down a bunch of different cards worth a different amount of points, and then each person picks up one card that determines their score, and whoever gets the higher score wins. Yeah, they dress it up with this tarot card idea, but that's really the premise of the entire game. You might as well both just roll a d20 and see who rolls higher on a single roll. That was the entire outcome. They bet their entire existence on this game. Well, since they both happen to randomly get the exact same score, neither one of them actually loses anything. Not only is this game essentially nothing, it ends up being a waste of time where neither side wins or loses. I can definitely see what my friends were saying when they told me about how the anime made some strange decisions and made the story worse than the original manga. If you like games where Yumeko acts like a total psycho with no sense of self-preservation, with lots of over-the-top reactions, you'll enjoy this arc more than I did. But in terms of gameplay, it rates fairly low. It's just slightly better than a singing and dancing competition, which is not even really a game. Number 11, basically a roulette game versus Yuriko. They use knives inside of a jar, and you shake up the jar, and the knives fall into specific locations, and this determines the results. That's the entire game. For the games that I know and understand, it's basically roulette. where the result is more or less supposed to be random. The knives just fall wherever they fall, and you are betting on the result of where the knives are going to fall. There are some minor notes about how the points are calculated and scored, but it ultimately doesn't matter too much in the end. Also, Yuriko is cheating by having the method rigged, but Yumeko catches her cheating. She acts really disgusted and calls her trash, which is entertaining. It tries to establish that Yumeko really hates cheaters, and she only wants to gamble in the most pure and fair way, but this will quickly become extremely inconsistent, and we'll get into that later. But for now, she decides she wants to wager everything on one completely fair gamble now that the cheating is gone, but then she just loses anyway. This is mostly a vehicle for the plot, so that Yumeko can take the role of the underdog, where she has no status and no resources, and she has to build her way up from the bottom class for the rest of the series. Doing this early on not only establishes a bit of her characterization, but it also establishes that, at least for games that have random results, it is possible for Yumeko to actually lose. She doesn't have infinite plot armor really, she's just very smart. And even if she's able to catch the other person cheating, this doesn't always mean that she can guarantee a victory either. Now honestly, from now on, she basically will continue to win over and over, especially when it matters, but at the very least, they tried to make it seem like she wasn't unbeatable. I do like this as a tone setter, even if the gameplay itself wasn't the best. Overall, everything from here on, even if I give criticisms or if I'm nitpicking the story elements, I pretty much enjoyed all of the rest of the material and the games themselves. Even the previous game, the tarot game, I enjoyed well enough. It was only the idle games that I didn't like. Number 10, the auction game versus Ray and also everyone else. Apparently, this one was another filler arc. In fact, as I learned, the entire character of Ray is just a filler character, which kind of makes sense when I look over things again. Ray doesn't do anything in the story until this point, they're just standing around. They show up and then they get eliminated in this one game. I'm not sure why the studio even decided to include an extra character in a season that has a lot of new characters already. It would maybe work if they had a really good story or a really good game that things built to at the end, but the game itself, oh man. Well, it's a step above the idle games because at least this was actually a competition, sort of some kind, and unlike the previous two games, at least it wasn't just 100% luck, but the logistics and the way the game plays out really gives off these vibes that tell you that you're watching filler. So I'll briefly explain how this happened and how it works to the best of my understanding, but the whole thing makes no sense anyway. So it's not really a game. Ray just puts a bunch of chips up for auction and then the players have to bid on them. However, you don't get a refund on any chips that you bid, so only the winning person gets back a lot of chips, and Ray gets to keep all of the bids, including the bids of the winner of losers. Now obviously there's no reason why anyone should ever play this game, but most of the players just lose about 50 IQ points and they start throwing away their chips for no reason. Not only do they choose to play it, but they actively continue throwing away chips when it's clear that there's no way to win, and this is only a way for Ray to get everybody's chips. There's multiple reveals, like Ray is cheating by making secret bids, and then Ray is cheating by having other people bid who are currently in a hidden location watching the auction in secret. Apparently the judges don't care about this at all, so the suspension of disbelief on neutrality of the games is just completely out the window. Then things get even more nonsensical. So Yumeko's solution is that she bids 101 chips to get back 100 chips, losing only one chip each time. And she basically keeps doing this over and over again until the other players in the hidden location also respond by making the same bid back to her. I guess somehow this is a signal that communicates a massive amount of information, and the other side now knows her entire plan, which is just for people to bid on the lots and not interfere with each other's bids. So everyone can just take turns getting 100 chips for free each time. Not for free, but for very cheap. I don't know why this works because it's what people should have been doing all along anyway, but now apparently they all agree to do it without ever having a real conversation. And then Ray, who could end the auction at any time, but chooses not to, again for no reason, loses about 70 IQ points and just repeatedly keeps giving away 100 of her chips at a time over and over again while allowing the other teams to keep bidding and winning the chips for almost nothing. We're not even going to talk about the fact that there's no system in place to determine who takes turns bidding on the really cheap lots, and why, for example, let's say Mary wouldn't just repeatedly bid one chip as fast as possible right away and never give anyone else a turn, or why the players didn't immediately go back to sniping each other, and Ray should have definitely stopped immediately, but whatever. The entire game is a narrative mess, but at least the characters have some entertaining and dramatic moments, and at least there's some kind of psychological elements at play here, and a little bit of something that resembles gamesmanship, at least more than just guessing a random number or drawing a card at random. Number 9 is the Russian roulette game versus Midari. This is more of a narrative-driven game than an actual game, although there are some elements of gaming involved. Honestly, the whole thing is basically just an excuse for Midari to set up this insane scenario where she can cheat so that Yumeko will seriously injure or even kill her. And no, that wasn't an error in my script, and you didn't hear me wrong. Midari is actually cheating because she intentionally wants to lose at a game of Russian roulette. Yumeko behaves a little bit strangely in this game because it seems like if she was against it, she could have just refused to play, but instead she goes along with it and tries to win so that she can stop it from happening. She's understandably creeped out by Midari's motivations, and this more or less is the story of the arc. Moving forward, Yumeko will basically always look down on Midari and think she's gross, because she hates someone who would intentionally try to lose at gambling. The whole Russian roulette masochism thing doesn't bother her as much. Midari will become increasingly obsessed with getting attention from Yumeko and wanting Yumeko to injure her, which never works out. It's a good time to mention that it's extremely common in this series for games to follow a structure where Yumeko catches the other person cheating and then uses their own cheating method to overcome them. This game technically follows the same format, but since Midari is cheating in order to intentionally throw the game, it's at least a little bit different, which is worth giving credit for. As for the game itself, it's similar to an Esper test, if you're familiar with those. They utilize Ryota by having him place cards in a specific order, and then the girls, who are in another room, need to try and guess the placement of the cards. Midari actually knows that Ryota and Yumeko will try to cheat with each other, but she's fine with this because she wants Yumeko to win anyway. However, when Yumeko does win, she just chooses to shoot the gun 0 times. Oh yeah, so basically they each get to load whatever number of bullets they want. Then one of their guns is chosen at random and they get to shoot as many times as they want. I have no idea why the show is so obsessed with these all or nothing gambles, because it would probably have been more tense if there was just one gun and we knew it always had 1 bullet in it. Then there would always be a threat that something might happen. Instead, we basically always know what's going to happen. If Yumeko gets her own gun, there's going to be no bullet, and if she gets Midari's gun, she just chooses not to shoot. The only real tension was requiring her to win the game every round, so that Midari would never get the gun. Watching how the characters behave is probably the highlight of this arc. Not only their extreme and absurd behavior, but also Yumeko's ability to stay calm under pressure and assess the situation. Also, watching Ryota attempt to cheat, but admitting to himself in his own thoughts that he's basically too stupid to cheat on a high enough level was also mildly amusing. Number 8 is Jankanpon versus Miri from the first episode of Season 1. If you don't know Jankanpon, it's essentially just rock, paper, scissors. However, in this introductory episode, Miri and Yumeko play a modified version of the game. They'll draw cards at random which only allow them to make very specific moves. The goal is to try and assess which cards your opponent might be holding, and which card you should play in response. But you also have to make that decision based on what you think your opponent might play. They actually don't try to make Yumeko into some kind of wine in front of me super genius who makes like 6th layer deductions on what Miri is going to do and plays a card to win based on that. Instead, the very first episode establishes a tradition which will honestly be utilized for almost every game in the entire series. Yumeko's opponent, in this case Miri, is going to try and cheat. You see, most of the players in the class are under her control, and she can tell them which cards to place into the voting box. Yumeko figures this out pretty quickly and uses her hand mirror to get a glimpse at the person standing behind her. Now that she can see which signal that person is giving, she also has the same information as Miri. At the very least, she knows what the most common card in the box is going to be. However, this doesn't automatically allow her to win. It's her willingness to risk everything and actually bet the result on a true gamble that gives her the chance to win. And in this case, she does actually win the game. I thought this was a solid introduction to the concept of Kakegurui and a really great pilot episode. If the series maintained this level of quality from start to finish, it would have been very good, but I would say about half the games ended up being even better than this one. So overall, the show did its best to improve on the premise as it kept going. Number 7 is the finger cutting game versus Erimi. This is another introductory episode, but this time it's the season 2 opener. I actually think they did a worse job of setting up this season, the characters and the premise, but I'll admit I did like the game itself maybe a little bit more. Let's talk about the story first, and I'll give you some of my complaints. They start things off using in media res, and then they jump back in time to explain everything, when they could have just started off by explaining things. There's a lot of completely unrelated exposition. The in media res isn't actually used to explain anything about the game that Yumeko is currently in or how it came about. It's literally just an excuse to show us something exciting or shocking at the very start of the episode, and then they go back and they do setup for the story, which they should have been setting up all along. Then we have to wait until episode 2 to even see any of the actual gameplay for the game that started 20 minutes ago. Imagine waiting a full week to get the next episode. That would have been crazy. It's so disappointing compared to season 1's introduction, how it was very self-contained, got you into the game, and resolved it all in one episode. However, I am ranking these based on the games. So for the game itself, you place your fingers inside inside of this machine, and you take turns cutting the strings one at a time. When the blade falls down, your fingers will get cut off. The last person to remove their finger from the machine wins. It's like an advanced game of chicken where you can actually get hurt really bad. This girl, named Erimi, is from a clan of torturers, and in a normal situation, you could see how her talents would be extremely powerful for defeating normal opponents. She's very good at the psychological aspects of the game. However, she's a pretty weak opponent for two reasons. First of all, she's another one who relies on cheating to gain an advantage, and this series really hammers home the idea that players who rely on cheating often just have their methods exposed and then end up losing because of it. If they played fair, they could have at least had a chance to win. Secondly, she's really bad at doing basic research, like the most basic research. Of all people, she invited Yumeko to this game and even allowed Midari to join. Now, Yumeko's entire thing is that she detects people's obvious cheating methods, and she's willing to risk everything on insane, almost self-destructive gambles. Trying to use a cheating method to scare her into giving up on a gamble is not a strategy that would ever work against Yumeko. Even if she failed to detect your cheat, she would still play the game to the end. As for Midari, she literally would prefer to lose the game and get her fingers cut off. There is no way to ever beat her in a game where the goal is to scare the other person into quitting before their fingers get cut off. It just doesn't work. In any case, in this game, Erimi's goal is to trick the other players into thinking that the game is real, but only she knows that the game would never actually cut off anyone's fingers. Yumeko figures this out and then sets up a situation where only Yumeko knows that the game is fake, and now Erimi has been tricked into thinking that it's all real. This causes her to mentally break down and quit the game while Yumeko and Midari win. Number 6 is the Tower of Doors versus Sayaka. Honestly, this arc was very confusing to me and seemed to be just filled with emotional and narrative whiplash. More than half the time, it seems like Kirari doesn't particularly care about Sayaka one way or the other, but then at the end of the arc, she just acts like she likes her, but then also apparently if she jumped out the wrong door, she would have actually died, so I guess she didn't really care enough to stop her from doing that. This also felt like a pretty unfair battle in more ways than one, with Sayaka coming across like a pretty passive character. She's lacking in agency, she has too much attachment to Kirari, so she can't really gamble the same way that Yumeko does, and she's just not mentally on the same level as Yumeko either. You know she's gonna get stomped in this game no matter what happens. Then again, we barely even see any of the puzzles. They're mostly just solved off screen or shown for like 6 seconds, and it makes it really difficult to tell how hard the puzzles actually were. The overall solution just depends on which character realizes the gimmick of the tower first, but while I was watching this, I guessed it immediately. So if Sayaka wasn't being really dumb for plot reasons, it seems like whoever goes first will actually always win the game. Furthermore, the wagers given for this game reminded me of what I didn't like about the end of Season 1. So maybe this is going to be pretty consistent whenever Kirari is involved. If you like games where characters pointlessly bet everything on extremely unclear odds and vague games without clear rules, but then the result is that nobody pays the penalty anyway, then hey, you might like the Kirari games. If Yumeko loses, she has to give up gambling forever, and this feels like a wager she would never actually make because she wouldn't want to stop gambling. But even if you think she is the kind of person who would accept that wager, it probably means she would have already done this at some point in the past, and then she would have lost, and she would never be allowed to gamble ever again. The logic, it just doesn't really hold up. And to make matters worse, Sayaka loses. She's betting her life and her relationship with Kirari in the process, but she gets to keep her life, and she gets to keep her relationship with Kirari. If anything, their relationship seems to have gotten even better, so in the end, Yumeko was betting the most important thing to herself, all of her power and her agency in the plot, when it seemed like she really wouldn't do that as carelessly as she did. But then, even if she would, she just ends up winning the game. But then, the person who lost doesn't even have to pay their penalty that they were supposed to pay. The arc itself was actually good. I'm complaining a lot, but I did enjoy watching it. But it's just another one of those cases where the meta logic breaks down for me. The one thing I can say to praise this arc is that it breaks away from the standard formula of Yumeko discovering the other player cheating and then using their own cheating method to counter-cheat them. At least Sayaka and Yumeko had a fair game with no tricks, no cheating, and they actually went head-to-head. But I wish we could have actually seen some of the puzzles and the games. Also, as good as high-stakes betting can be, when you utilize it properly, there has to be a limit to the wagers, and the penalties should actually be enforced and be meaningful. Otherwise, it's going to erode the sense of tension and the stakes from other games in the future. Number 5, the nail-ripping game versus Sumeragi, or card memorization. This game is our first introduction to Sumeragi, and probably one of the most interesting things about her is that she initially seems like a throwaway opponent who will be defeated in one episode and then never seen again. But no, actually she turns out to be one of the more important and frequently appearing characters later on in the series, probably in the top 5 at least. The goal of this game is to flip over cards 2 at a time and try to match them. In order to win, you need to be able to memorize the placement of the cards. That way, if you flip over a card that's already been shown, you'll remember where the first matching card was and be able to claim both of them. As long as you keep matching cards, you can also keep flipping forever. Sumeragi cheats by using a deck of cards that has been marked, so that she'll always know the placement of every card. But she does this thing that a lot of characters actually do where after they win by cheating, for some reason they agree to play another game against Yumeko, and then it's revealed that Yumeko figured out her cheating method, and then she uses it to beat her. If you just stop after winning the first game, Yumeko would have been toast. This episode definitely highlighted Yumeko's absurd level of honestly unrealistic genius. She not only memorized the placement of the cards during the first game, but she memorized all of the markings on the back of the cards which were used to cheat after seeing them only one time. But whatever, it's anime. I'm fine with that. So during the second game, Yumeko starts to just flip over all of the cards immediately. She doesn't seem to get as mad about the cheating this time for whatever reason. Overall, she's pretty inconsistent about when she finds cheating to be disgusting and unacceptable, and other times when she either doesn't care, or she even participates in utilizing her own cheating methods to win other games. Well, anyway, this episode had a really dark element to it, where Sumeragi makes a wager that the opponent has to rip off their own fingernails and give them to her if they lose. You know, if I remember correctly, the way this game ends is absolutely insane too, because I think Yumeko, after winning, she just says that Sumeragi doesn't have to give her anything or have to pay any kind of penalty. Now, it might come up again in a few more episodes where she cashes in on the debt, but it's still pretty wild that you play a game where the other person is demanding you to rip off your own fingernails. And then when you win, you're just like, yeah, I don't care. You don't have to pay anything. Like, Yumeko would risk ripping off her own fingernails for no gain. And it really hammers home the point that for Yumeko, the gamble itself is the reward, whether she wins or losing. But I still feel like this almost suspended my disbelief a little bit too much. You should at least accept the money that you're supposed to get from winning the game. And for all future games, she does this, so it seems like this is a one-off case where she shows Sumeragi in particular mercy and doesn't do the same for anyone else later, which is really weird because Sumeragi tried to cheat and she hates cheaters, and Sumeragi tried to rip off her fingernails, but I guess she just really likes Sumeragi. Number 4 is the debt replacement game, where Miri and Yumeko play against Tsubami and Kiwatari. This is definitely one of the more exciting games in the series. You have Yumeko and Miri teaming up together for the first time. The mechanics of the game itself are explained well enough and shown in enough detail that you can feel the weight of each moment, each action, each line of dialogue. Also, there are pure gaming strategies, metagaming strategies, effective methods of cheating, as well as psychological elements all at play here. So it really has a mix of all of the best qualities of what make a great game in Kakegurui. There's even story and character moments and narrative payoff here. It's good stuff all around. Now let's talk about the rules of the game. Each player draws 2 cards. One of the cards is revealed to the public, and the other card is kept hidden. If you get a pair, that's the strongest hand. If you get 2 cards with a matching suit, that's the second strongest hand. Otherwise, you have a 0 value hand, where the high value card wins, in the event of a tie. The interesting Kakegurui twist on this game is that each person has chips worth a different amount of money, based on their amount of debt going into the game. Kiwatari and Tsubami have a method where they cheat by telling each other their hands, and then this gives them a slight advantage because Kiwatari can also tell Tsubami when to fold and when to raise and things like that. The issue with their method is that it's actually visible to Yumeko and Miri, so they just immediately catch on to it. By trying to signal to their teammates what their hand is, Kiwatari actually ends up showing his hand to his opponents every time, and they take advantage of that. Then, Yumeko and Miri reveal they've also been cheating the entire time, but they were just doing it under the table without being detected. This makes Kiwatari look even more like a small fry when it comes to the metagame and cheating aspects. Finally, in the end, there's an additional reveal that Miri and Yumeko swapped the value of their debts, so that the Miri chips and the Yumeko chips were worth the opposite amount, based on what Kiwatari expected. This causes him to lose a ton of money in the end. It was a really satisfying turnabout where everything felt logically consistent and the stakes felt just warm enough to be satisfying, without being too cold or too hot. Some of the games that we talked about earlier were way too over the top, and they did suffer for that. The mechanics for how the debt transfer works were a little bit confusing, especially with people intentionally taking on fake debts in order to buy into the game to try and win money. However, the end result is that Miri gains 300 million yen, and Kiwatari has to pay the 300 million penalty to the student council. The other players ended up with a net 0 change in debts. Basically, this entire game was Yumeko helping Miri to just get rid of her debt. Number 3 is the Nim Type 0 game versus Miyo and Miri. This game establishes that the neutrality of the judges is comically incompetent at best or non-existent at worst. They keep going on and on about how they're neutral, but they let one side literally poison the other side, and then wager the antidote in place of money or using chips. Wow, that seems really fair, huh? These meta factors are definitely silly, but at least this is an actual game. It's not a singing and dancing competition. To be honest, in spite of my complaints about the story structure here, it was one of my favorite actual games in the series. We don't get to see Yumeko play, but Miri does a good job of playing the game with support from Ryota. This gives both characters a chance to shine, and to be honest, I didn't realize this until I did my rankings, but it actually has a lot of things in common with the debt replacement game. You have two characters playing against two other characters, unofficially in this case, and a game based on which cards are drawn, trying to hide the information from your opponents while revealing it to your ally, as well as Miri being in the driver's seat for this arc. The Nim Zero game is sort of like a mix of 4-player, co-op, PvP, blackjack, and kind of like Uno. It's a little difficult to explain. Oh, also, speaking about the neutrality of the judges, they intentionally used a method of shuffling the deck which allowed Miri to be able to tell which cards the other opponents were holding. This arc in particular just annihilated the entire idea that the judges are actually neutral. So if you didn't understand how Miri's cheating method worked, it goes like this. The 16 cards distributed to the players all came from the top of the deck because of the way that it was shuffled. So instead of being truly random, there was always going to be 4 of each number. 4 cards with the value 1, 4 cards 2, 4 cards 3, and 4 cards showing 4, respectively. So if Miri was able to see her own cards, and then she asks Ryota to show her his cards, she's going to know the other 8 cards that Miyo and Miri are holding. The most interesting thing I found was that Miyo thinks that Miri will just take advantage of Ryota and use him as a pawn, forcing him to sacrifice himself so that Miri can win or at least avoid losing. This is why she's unable to understand what Miri is actually doing. When the situation is reversed, Miyo forces Miri to sacrifice herself, and Miri actually listens to Miyo, she does what she says, she poisons herself, and this doesn't even damage their relationship at all. I found this to be very weird, but it works narratively. It's a logically consistent plot point because Miyo is the kind of person who would do this to her ally, and her lack of empathy is the reason why she can't imagine Miri and Ryota doing anything different. She can't imagine them working together. I would love to see games like this in the series more often, and it seems like games that involve around Miri, especially team-based games, tend to be some of the best material in the show. Number 2, the Paying Your Taxes game, featuring a lot of characters. Manyuuda and Sumeragi return in this game, Miroslava and Ibarra are playing their very first game on screen, and Yumeko is more like the fifth wheel in this one. I was surprised that I liked this game as much as it did because it had a very simple premise, but it was actually very entertaining. The game itself works by having players go into a room one at a time, and they can choose to either bank their money in a selfish play, or pay taxes which yield more points for everyone in the game, including themselves. The scoring system is set up so that if everyone pays their taxes every turn, I think what happens is everyone either loses just slightly or no one profits. I can't remember which it was, but either way it turns out to be sort of like a prisoner's dilemma. The only way to profit is by being selfish and banking some of your own money, at least some of the time. But if everyone always banks their own money, there won't be enough money from the taxes to reach the amount needed to win the game. So in this case, if you be selfish at the wrong times, you're still going to be in first place, but everyone loses and you lose all of your money. The trick to winning is to be selfish just enough to get ahead of everyone else, while still clearing enough points to win the game. You have to be able to manipulate others and lie to them. The discussions between the characters in between the tax-paying rounds were the most interesting part for me, and I actually wish we had gotten more of this, or more emphasis on this aspect of the game. They could have made 3 episodes with this material, and I probably would have been totally fine with it. It reminds me of Mafia or the Werewolf game a little bit, as well as other social games that you might be familiar with. The overall game and the story were solid. Miroslava and Ibarra ended up being surprisingly honest and straightforward characters. Like, even though Miroslava was on the traitor team, she basically was just following orders, and she put her faith and her trust in Sumeragi, who was a complete stranger to her. Meanwhile, Ibarra pretty much trusted everyone the entire game and accepted everything that he was told in every round. He seemed to be upset about the idea that someone would lie or cheat. This feels like the kind of team that Yumeko would actually enjoy playing with in a straight-up gamble. It's just too bad they weren't as skilled at the actual gambling side of things, but then again, they might have other games that they're good at. And also, Yumeko's feelings about cheating and the purity of the game basically change from game to game anyway. Manyuuda was a little bit too passive for a little bit too long, but I did like the strategy that Sumeragi used to win the game. In spite of my minor complaints that I have, this was definitely one of the best games in the series. I feel like Season 2 really peaked around the middle of this season, and if I was going to check out the manga, it would probably be because of arcs like this. And that brings us to number 1, the selective poker game versus Manyuuda. I consider this to be the true finale of Season 1, especially knowing now that the final episode was a complete filler game anyway. Honestly, looking back at the list, it seems as if the games with Manyuuda, Sumeragi, and Miri are some of the best material in the show, at least for my enjoyment. This game is essentially poker, but after all of the bets have been confirmed, the last player gets to decide if the higher value or the lower value hand will win. So under normal rules, a full house would beat a pair, but if you're holding a pair and you think the opponent has a better hand, you can reverse the value and win by having the weaker hand. This game forces you to consider the value value of what you're holding, but it places a lot of emphasis on your ability to read your opponent and understand the game as a whole. Because of story reasons, it mostly turns into a battle of wills, bluffing, and psychological elements, but there was still a lot of game theory and logic, and it was cool that they were able to fit all of these elements into a single arc. After Yumeko loses originally, Sumeragi joins the game so that it can continue on. There's a subplot between her and Manyuuda, and I won't get into all of the elements of their relationship because it's extremely complicated and I want to focus mostly on the gameplay here. However, I think these elements struck the perfect balance between adding to the story, developing the characters, and allowing the game to unfold in the most interesting way possible. You could say that because both players are allowed to keep funneling money into the game, or anything of value that they want to wager, the end result will ultimately come down to a single hand, where Yumeko and Manyuuda both bet all in on the largest wager. This is definitely what happens in the end. However, I think that it ignores a lot of the other elements that went into making this one of the best games of the series. So one of the things I really loved about this arc, and which set it apart so much, is that Manyuuda doesn't even try to cheat at all in this game. He goes head to head with Yumeko, and he even defeats her at the start. It doesn't follow the typical format where the other player cheats and Yumeko catches them in order to win. We get to see Manyuuda's thought process and the logic that goes into deciding when he bets, when he folds, when he raises. He actually almost feels like the protagonist of this arc, because we rarely get to see where Yumeko is thinking. We only see what Manyuuda is thinking about what she is doing, and Yumeko herself feels like the final boss. I talked about this during the discussion of the debt replacement game. Making the logic clear and easy to follow, and having us walk through the steps of what the players are doing and why they are doing it, makes every move and every line and every action from the characters feel more exciting. It's much better than only getting a vague idea about how the game is unfolding. This narrative weight is the mark of great writing, and I also talked before about how many times characters end up losing because they tried to cheat, and it ends up being exploitable. Having Manyuuda defeat Yumeko by not cheating makes him a really fitting final boss of the first season. Is there anything I forgot to mention? Any games that you loved or hated? If you leave a comment below, you'll get a hug from someone who isn't trying to poison you. But for now, enjoy the rest of your day.